The glass doors didn't open when I tapped my badge. I tried again, slower this time. Like the system might recognize patience as authority. But the light stayed red. It was 8:57 a.m. 3 minutes before the weekly executive briefing. The one I had built half the data for. The one where the board would finally see the numbers I'd been warning about for months. Behind the glass, people walked past me without looking up. Coffee cups in hand, laptops under arms. Faces relaxed in the careless way people look when they believe the ground under them is solid. A security guard I barely knew cleared his throat and said my name like it was already past tense. Told me my access had been temporarily restricted and that HR would be with me shortly. That was the moment I understood they hadn't just locked me out of the office. They were trying to lock me out of the story entirely. I stood there, backpack still slung over one shoulder, watching the company I'd helped scale from a regional operation into a global player move on without me. For 7 years I had been the person who stayed late when systems failed, who answered calls on weekends, who built the licensing framework that turned a risky internal tool into a royalty machine. I wasn't a public face. I wasn't flashy. But I knew where everything was buried because I'd helped bury it properly. Or so I thought. My phone buzzed. An automated email informed me that my calendar had been cleared and my accounts were under review. No explanation, no accusation, just silence dressed up as procedure. HR finally arrived. All practiced sympathy and neutral language. They said there were concerns about a discrepancy. A single-line item in a licensing report. Something small but serious enough to warrant immediate action. I almost laughed. That one line was the very thing I'd been flagging internally. The mismatch between reported royalties and actual inflows from a partner subsidiary. I'd written memos, built models, asked for audits. Each time I was told to let it go, that it was above my scope, that I didn't understand the bigger picture. Now that line was being used to erase me. They asked me to hand over my badge. I did, calmly, because somewhere under the shock, something else was settling in. They had made a mistake. They assumed locking me out meant locking me down. They assumed my value was tied to my access card and my company email. What they didn't account for was the licensing escrow. The one set up years earlier when the company expanded overseas. The one designed to protect us if a partner ever defaulted. I had structured it so royalties flowed through a third party. Trust before distribution. A safeguard that required dual acknowledgement to alter. Mine was one of those acknowledgements. Removing me from the building didn't remove my name from the architecture. And more importantly, it didn't remove my memory. By noon, rumors were already spreading. People texted to ask if I was okay, if I knew what was happening. I replied with variations of working through it, because there was no point explaining yet. I went home, opened my laptop, and pulled up the mirrored files I kept not out of paranoia, but habit. Version histories, approval chains, timestamps. The one office lie was already there, sitting clean and obvious once you knew where to look. A backdated amendment that rerouted royalty calculations through a shell entity, shaving fractions off each transaction. Fractions that meant nothing to an individual line, but everything when multiplied across continents and years. $15 billion worth of everything. They thought they were protecting the company by sacrificing me. In reality, they had just removed the one person who'd been quietly keeping the balance. And as the day went on, as executives congratulated themselves on decisive action, the systems they'd taken for granted kept running exactly as designed. Inching closer to a reconciliation deadline, no one but me remembered. When that clock hit 0, the truth wouldn't come out in a meeting. It would come out in filings, in audits, in places where spin doesn't survive contact with math. By the time the sun set, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't HR. It was a number I didn't recognize, followed by a voicemail marked urgent. I listened once, then again, and felt the corner of my mouth lift despite myself. They were asking questions now. The kind you ask when you realize the story you tried to control is about to be told without you. And for the first time that day, I didn't feel locked out at all. The voicemail wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a question. It was fear wrapped in corporate politeness. They wanted to clarify a few items before close of business. Wanted to understand why the escrow reconciliation dashboard had suddenly locked itself, and why an automated notice had gone out to 3 external partners asking them to confirm royalty flows independently. That notice wasn't supposed to go out for another 2 weeks. Unless, of course, someone had forced an early reconciliation without realizing what it would trigger. I didn't call back right away. I let the silence stretch, the same silence they'd used on me all morning. Instead, I walked through my apartment, made coffee, sat down, and opened the master ledger. Years earlier, when we were expanding fast and everyone was obsessed with growth at any cost, I'd insisted on one thing. Every licensing stream had to be traceable end to end. Redundancy is safety, I'd said in a meeting where half the room rolled their eyes. They wanted speed. I wanted proof. The compromise was a system that looked automatic on the surface, but required human intent at key junctions. My intent, or someone else's, clearly logged. At 4:12 p.m., the first external confirmation came in. Then another. Each one matched my original projections. Not the internal reports the executives had been presenting for the last 6 quarters. By 5 o'clock, the discrepancy wasn't a rounding error anymore. It was a canyon. And because the trust was independent, the data didn't belong to the company. It belonged to the regulators who had oversight on the structure. When the automated threshold was breached, notifications went out by design. Not to punish, to protect. My phone rang again. This time it was my direct supervisor's number. The same man who hadn't made eye contact when HR took my badge. He spoke fast, too fast, saying there had been a misunderstanding. That maybe things had moved too quickly. That they wanted me back in the building first thing tomorrow to talk it through. I asked one question calmly. Have you checked the escrow reports yet? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. By evening, the story was no longer internal. A compliance firm had flagged unusual variance in a multinational royalty stream, tied to intellectual property registered under our company's name. That IP was the crown jewel, the thing every investor presentation revolved around, the thing that justified the valuation. Without clean royalties, the valuation wasn't aggressive. It was fraudulent. And because the numbers crossed borders, it wasn't just a company issue anymore. It was a regulatory one. At 9:38 p.m., an email hit my personal inbox from an address I recognized instantly. Outside counsel. Not HR. Not management. Lawyers don't ask you to come back to the office. They ask you to preserve records. They ask you not to delete anything. They ask you to confirm timelines. They ask because they already know something is wrong, and they're trying to figure out how bad it is. I slept that night better than I had in months. The next morning, headlines didn't mention my name. They mentioned an internal review, then an independent audit, then, quietly, trading volatility tied to uncertainty in licensing revenue recognition. By noon, the board announced an emergency session. By evening, 2 executives were placed on administrative leave. The office doors were still locked to me, but it didn't matter anymore. The building had become irrelevant. The truth was moving without permission. 3 days later, I was asked formally, carefully, if I would be willing to walk an external team through the original system design, not as an employee, as a consultant. They offered terms that would have sounded impossible a week earlier. I didn't answer immediately. I asked for time. Because power shifts feel different when you've lived on the other side of the door. In the end, I agreed, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the record to be clean. Billions don't disappear quietly. They leave fingerprints. And when the final report came out, it didn't say one office lie. It listed dates, names, approvals, and intent. It showed exactly who benefited, exactly who knew, and exactly who assumed the person they locked out wouldn't be able to speak. They were wrong. I never went back to that office. I didn't need to. The lockout that was supposed to end my career became the moment everything was exposed. And the people who thought they'd silenced me learned something the hard way. Systems remember, even when people try to forget.